Good morning. Thank you, Hannah. A couple things. First off, I would like to thank you guys for, on this Memorial Day weekend, putting the veterans back into Memorial Day. Sometimes I worry that sometimes we talk about Christ not being in Christmas. I think sometimes Memorial Day becomes too much about cookouts and high school graduations and the end of school, and I'm involved in all of those things too. But I think it's important that we do put the focus where it needs to be, and that's with our men and women in the armed services, past and present. So I really appreciate that. I want to thank Dee Dee for asking me to come out and speak today. I always enjoy any opportunity I get to recognize the sacrifices in the service. When Dee Dee told me what the theme was, I decided I kind of did a little bit of work on this. This is not a topic I've done a ton with, but I was very interested in the history of the MIA. So I'm going to give you just kind of a brief history of actually, because the word has actually kind of changed meaning over the years. Initially, and as long as America has been involved in wars, there have always been soldiers who were missing in action. And generally what that meant back 100, 150 years ago was that their bodies were just simply not retrieved. The earliest reference I could find to an MIA from Fayette County goes back to the American Civil War. And I found a soldier, he was actually a farmer from the county by the name of L.W. Saxton. He was injured at the Battle of Shiloh, but like a lot of men, he returned back to his unit. He participated in Sherman's March to the Sea, and he was injured again at a battle in Georgia called Kennesaw Mountain. And at Kennesaw Mountain, his captain records that the last thing that he saw was he saw Saxton on the field, injured, and then that was the last anybody ever saw or heard from him. His body was never recovered. It was never returned to Fayette County. And again, like a lot of, in fact, 50% of the Civil War soldiers in national cemeteries are marked under unknown graves. So there's a very high percentage. So that's the first reference that I could find of and I'm sure there are others before that. But again, he was like many men and women who went to service, and you don't know what your lot is. And he is likely buried in an unknown soldier's grave on the battlefield. And again, that was a fairly common, at the time of the Civil War, that was fairly common. When you get to World War II, I should go back a bit. If we go to World War I. When you get to World War I, one of the things, again, you see are soldiers who lose their life in battle, and then in some cases it was several years before they were returned. We have several veterans here today from both post 25 and post 653. Lieutenant Paul Huey, who was a pilot in World War I, and of course whom is the namesake of post 25, was shot down in battle on September 14th, 1918. His body was not returned to this country for 3 years. And in fact, there was a lot of work that was done. Also interesting to note about World War I pilots. The average life expectancy of a World War I pilot was 3 weeks. Your survival rate in combat was about 3 weeks. And again, sometimes we see the kind of the glamorous flying of things, but it was an incredibly dangerous thing. And again, Lieutenant Huey, whom post-25 is their namesake, was shot down in September. In fact, his family had just received a letter that he had written. He was killed before his family received word that he had lost his life in battle. In fact, they had just received a letter from him talking about what it was like to fly. So again, it's amazing. Today we're so used to instant communications, these lapses in time. The Homer Lawson Post 653 also was named after a Fayette County veteran, Homer Lawson, who was an African-American who was serving actually with the French, because at that time a lot of the African-American U.S. regiments were brigaded with the French. He loses his life in battle actually 2 weeks later, in September 28th, 1918. His body is not returned to the United States for another 3 years. So missing in action in those days, lots of times, was literally a recovery effort, as these men, their lives were lost in battle, and then it took time, if they were found, identified, and returned home. That's what led to, in 1921, Congress approved probably the most famous single veterans memorial in the country, and that is the Tomb of the Unknown. And literally, the Tomb of the Unknown was founded the same year that both those men's bodies were brought back to this area, and it's not a coincidence because so many soldiers lost their lives in Europe in World War I as they were bringing them back. What's interesting, when Congress approved this at World War I, and of course this is one of the really famous quotes, and I think it really hits home, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." And again, let me repeat that because I think these are powerful words. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God. And that began a practice that was started in World War I as well as World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And so if you get the opportunity to visit the Tomb of the Unknown, there are soldiers there from those. And again, these were men who were missing in action, were never identified, and bodies were returned and to, again, known but to God. We get to World War II, and it's kind of staggering. To this day, there are 73,000 MIAs from World War II. 73,000, that's the largest number. And again, these are men that lost their lives in the jungles. These are men who lost their lives in Germany. And in fact, some of you are probably familiar. The last several years, we've had an archaeologist who has worked with my students, and we've done mapping in the cemeteries and have done some interesting things. He was flown to Guadalcanal 2 summers ago with his equipment to still do recovery of U.S. Marines whose bodies have not been returned. So, I mean, this is from World War II. So this is a process that continues on. And anyhow, it was Dr. Jerry Burks, and I know that was a real special thing for him when he had the opportunity to go and to actually, work to try to identify. So, this is a process that goes on. So, as we speak, there are about 73,000 MIAs from World War II, about 8,000 from Korea, and then we get to Vietnam. And I think Vietnam is where the word takes on a little different meaning again, because one of the things with Vietnam was that we believed that a lot of these men who had gone missing were actually POWs. And so I think the MIA word again takes on kind of a different meaning. In 1973, the number was about 2,500. Today, the number of MIAs from Vietnam is about 1,600, so the number's dropped by about 1,000. But again, they are actively, and really just over the last several years, the Vietnamese government has cooperated with the United States, and they are, again, actively looking to retrieve and bring home these men who, again, lost their lives the bodies were never recovered nor identified and were brought back. We can come up to the current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the number of MIAs is approximately 6. And certainly that's not to minimize that number. You probably remember several years ago, Matt Maupin, the young man from Batavia, Ohio, not that darn far from here, who was an MIA, and ultimately his body was brought back. He was murdered by his captors, and his body was brought back. But certainly I think Matt Maupin put a face on the MIA and POW, and again, his family has been very active in the MIA POW from Batavia, and as I was putting this together, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking even though the numbers are not nearly as dramatic as they were at the time of Vietnam, we still have men and women in combat as we speak, and I think sometimes again it kind of gets pushed to the back page a little bit. I'd like to offer my own kind of a definition of an MIA in 2014, because this is another, I do a lot with veterans and veterans issues. And this is something that I was shocked by when I heard this statistic, and it still kind of troubles me. The Veterans Administration in 2013 released a statistic that 22 veterans a day commit suicide. There are 22 suicides a day. For a whole, litany of reasons. But what that says to me is, many of these young men, young women, even when they come home, they're not home. They're not able to, go on with their lives, with their families, with their jobs. So in many ways, though they're physically here, in many ways they're still missing. And I think, I find that statistic shocking. And I think as a, as a community, as a country, we need to continue to recognize, and again, that's a VA statistic, 22, that is more than are losing their lives in combat right now. 22 veterans a day commit suicide. And so, I think though they're here, I think in many ways they're still missing. And certainly one of my hopes is that as we move through the Memorial Day season, as we recognize veterans from both past and present, we continue to think about that. As I heard the story earlier, and I liked when we were talking to young people about, what is Memorial Day? Earlier this week, actually, Dee Dee knows this, I took my classes I've done for several years to put flags out at the cemetery. And there are always people who say, well, I don't know if that's a good use of your time or not. And you know what? I cannot think of a better classroom than getting those young people out in the cemetery and putting out flags and talking about, and I think there's about 1,000 veterans in Washington Cemetery, and the folks out in the cemetery are doing a fantastic job. And I can't think of a better classroom. And of course, Hannah knows this. One of the things that I think I think we need to get students out sometimes behind the books and more involved in the community, and I think those are the things that I think enrich things. What I'd like to conclude with today is a poem that I always like to use, and it goes back to one of my earliest memories of Veterans Day. I grew up on a farm over east of here. I'm from over by Lancaster, Ohio, and I used to always go to Memorial. My mother would always take me to Memorial Day services in Pleasantville, little town, if you know where it is. They're probably still doing a service this weekend. And as I was just a child, and I remember there was this elderly lady who would walk up, and she had this dark piece of paper, it was clearly faded, and she would read this poem. And everybody was always in great reverence of her, and I came to find out later that she had lost her husband in World War I. So this was something that went, back, and this is, of course, years ago. And it is still one of my favorite poems. It was written by a soldier in World War I who later lost his life. And so I will conclude with this today. In Flanders Field. In Flanders Field the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Field. Thank you.